Purity of blood and the evolution of racial classification. Certain authors have sought to link the castas in Latin America to the older Spanish concept of purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, originating under the Moorish rule developed in Christian Spain to denote those without Jewish or Muslim heritage, or more widely, heritage from individuals convicted by the Spanish Inquisition for heresy. It was directly linked to religion and notions of legitimacy, lineage, and honor following Spain's reconquest of Moorish territory and the degree to which it can be considered a precursor to the modern concept of race has been the subject of academic debate. Okay, I want to go back for a second to just clarify some things. This is an Obama sweatshirt. Okay, so I have a black president right now on my fucking sweatshirt. What they are talking about here, if you don't know, the Moors are an ancient group of Africans who were very rich and owned a lot of land. They were just like kings and queens, and they were extremely royal. But it looks like they were taken over by Spanish conquistadores. A lot of this goes back to like those LA gangs that you always hear about, like Bloods and Crips. That kind of actually goes back to basically this conquest for land of Africans versus Spaniards. So, just if you don't know some of that history, this does stem back pretty long. Both in Spain and in the New World, conversos who continued to practice Judaism in secret were aggressively prosecuted. Nobody historically has ever liked Jews. Like, Jewish people are not popular, if that's not clear. Of the roughly 40 people executed by the Spanish Inquisition in Mexico, a significant number were convicted of being Judaizers. I think this just means Jewish. Spanish conquistador Luis de Carvajal y de la Cueva was persecuted by the Inquisition for secretly practicing Judaism and eventually died in prison. In Spanish America, the idea of purity of blood also applied to black Africans and indigenous peoples, since as Spaniards of Moorish and Jewish descent, they had not been Christian for various generations and were inherently suspect of engaging in religious heresy. In all Spanish territories, including Spain itself, evidence of lack of purity of blood had consequences for eligibility for office, entrance into the priesthood, and immigration into Spain's overseas territories. Having to produce genealogical records to prove one's pure ancestry gave rise to a trade in the creation of false genealogies, a practice which was already widespread in Spain itself. This was no impediment for intermarriage between Spaniards and indigenous people, just as it had not been in old and new Christians or different racial groups coexisting in late medieval and early modern Spain. The result was generations of mixed race children who were typically considered Spaniards, and most of whom returned to Spain to join the ranks of the nobility, a notable example being Juan Cano Montezuma. However, starting in the late 16th century, some investigations of ancestry classified as stains any connection with black Africans, negros, which resulted in mulattoes and sometimes mixtures with indigenous people that produced mestizos. While some illustrations from the period show men of African descent dressed in fashionable clothing and as aristocrats in upper class surroundings, the idea that any hint of black ancestry was a stain developed by the end of the colonial period, a time at which biological racism began to emerge throughout the Western world. This trend was illustrated in the 18th century paintings of racial hierarchy known as Casta paintings, which led to 20th century emergence of theories on a Casta system existing in colonial Spanish America. The idea in New Spain or native or Indian Indo blood in a lineage was an impurity may well have come about as the optimism of the early Franciscans faded about creating Indian priests trained at the Colegio de Santa Cruz Teologo, which ceased that function in the mid 16th century. In addition to the Indian nobility, which was recognized by the Spanish colonists, had declined in importance, and there were fewer formal marriages between Spaniards and indigenous women than during the early decades of the colonial era. In the 17th century in New Spain, the ideas of purity of blood became associated with Spanishness and whiteness, but it came to work together with socio-economic categories, such that a lineage with someone engaged in work with their hands was tainted by that connection. Indians in central Mexico were affected by ideas of purity of blood from the other side. Crown decrees on purity of blood were affirmed by indigenous communities, which barred Indians from holding office who had any non Indians, like Spaniards or black people, in their lineage. In indigenous communities, local caciques, rulers, and principals were granted a set of privileges and rights on the basis of their pre Hispanic noble bloodlines and acceptance of their Catholic faith. Indigenous nobles submitted proofs of their purity of blood to affirm their rights and privileges that were extended to themselves and their communities. This supported the República de Indios, a legal division of society that separated indigenous from non-Indians. Huh.